Hi everyone, Stepan here. In this video I'm going to answer a question I've been getting a lot, and that's, can I play the London system for black? Okay, my answer is always yes, I play it with black whenever I can. So the follow-up questions are, when can I play it? How can I play it? I'm going to answer all of that in the video. And I'm going to show you all openings and setups white could play that you could respond to with the London system. Okay, let's get into it. The first thing is, this is the setup we are aiming for. This is the London system. If we look at the London system for white, it's just the reverse image of this. The bishop is on f4 instead of f5. The first thing we should note, the London is not possible against e4. If they play e4, you cannot go d5 and then bishop f5 because you are in a Scandinavian. Also after e4 you cannot go bishop f5 because it's illegal. Okay, against the Queen's Gambit, the London is also not possible. Let's just get through with this. So after d4, d5, if they play c4, it's not possible to go for the London, and here is why. Now we are going to get familiar with the most famous pattern in the London system for both colors, which is why it doesn't work with black and it works with white. So in order to get the London, we want to achieve e6, c6, bishop f5. So let's start with c6 going into a normal Slav. Knight f3, knight f6. Knight to c3. Okay, at this point we would like to play the move bishop f5. Unfortunately, bishop f5 loses, and this is a very, very famous mistake which people keep making. You would like to play the London setup, but you lose to cd, cd, and queen to b3. And now there is no way out of this. If you play bishop c8, which is the best move, you've achieved nothing. If you play queen b6, then simply knight to d5. And if you play b6, then it's even worse. You lose on the spot against e4. Okay, and that's the long story short. Why does this work for white? Well, here's the difference. If we try to do the same thing with the white pieces, so we start with d4, black plays knight f6, we go bishop to f4, and they go c5. Okay, they haven't wasted the tempo on d5. With d5, it's even easier. And we try e3. We get the same position, queen to b6. Now, even white has problems dealing with this, and this is one of the trickiest ways for black to respond to the Londons, but white has the saving move, knight to c3. And there's a ton of theory here. I don't want to get into it, but it's possible to get away with the London for white against an early c5 or against a Queen's Gambit setup for black. That's simply not possible. Okay, now let's continue. When can you play the London with the black pieces? Well, the first thing we have to look at is the Reti. This is the most topical opening I've started playing the London against, and this is the opening against which it works best. Before we get into this, I would like to say that the London system for black is an extremely good opening to have alongside the Semi-Slav defense, because they are very similar, with the only difference that the bishop is not on c8 but on f5, and because whenever the London is impossible to play for black, you can play the Semi-Slav setup. Okay, so those are two very good complementary setups which work together best. Okay, let's have a look at this. Okay, knight f3. White starts with knight f3, starts with the Reti. Let's try to get our London system. Okay, d5. White continues c4, we continue c6. White continues e3, we continue knight to f6. And now there are several things white could do here. There are three main moves: d4, knight c3, and b3. Against d4 and knight c3, the London is simply not possible. We saw why. If they go knight to c3, and we go bishop to f5, we are in trouble. Why are we in trouble? Well, simply c takes d5, c takes d5, and queen to b3. Same pattern. It doesn't work. We need to drop our bishop back to c8. Okay, so against knight to c3, we have to play the Semi-Slav. Okay, we got to know this already. The same thing goes for d4. Again, if we go bishop f5, we saw this, takes, queen b3, doesn't work. Which leads us to when you can play the London against the Reti. It's against b3 setups. Against b3 setups, bishop f5 is my favorite move. I've played it against grandmasters. I've played it in 5 or 6 games during the last 3 months in tournament games. And bishop f5 works here simply because there is no queen b3. Okay, and against the Reti with b3, London system for black is my favorite response. Okay, bishop to b2, e6, and we have our setup. Now we are playing the London. Now we have the same opening we would like to play with the white pieces. Okay, let's have a short look at this. Bishop to e2, h6. We want to avoid knight h4 winning our bishop. White castles, knight bd7, very normal London. d3, and in most cases with the reverse London, we are not going to be playing bishop d6 like we play bishop d3 for white. We play bishop to e7. Why? And especially against the Reti, because white in many positions wants to play e4, e5, well, e4, e5, and we don't want to lose a piece. Okay, so that's the Reti. English. Okay, the same thing applies for the English opening. You know that I play the Caro-Kann. If you don't, then I do play the Caro-Kann. Against the English, I play c6. This is called the Caro-Kann defensive system, but I want to achieve one of three different things. I either want to play a Caro-Kann, a Semi-Slav defense, or a London system for black. And it's almost impossible for white to avoid all of them. Okay, if they go e4, I have a Caro-Kann, perfect. Perfect, perfect, perfect. If they go d4, I have a Slav or Semi-Slav, or maybe if they go b3, as we saw, I can still go for bishop f5. And if they go knight to f3, which is the most common move, I go d5. Again, if they go d4 or knight to c3, I'm going to probably be playing the Semi-Slav defense. If they go e3, I go knight f6. And now again, we have a transpose to the Reti. We know that against d4 or knight to c3, we play the Semi-Slav. We know that against b3, we play the London system. So we can try to play it against the English. Against the Reti and against the English, which is basically 25% of all openings for white, we can try to play the London for black, if they allow it. They mostly allow it against me, because they know I play the Semi-Slav as my main weapon against d4, which is why I said it's very good to play the Semi-Slav and the London for black, because then they're not going to be able to avoid it. Now, let's get into the openings against which the London system for black is unavoidable. Okay, unavoidable. The first one is the King's Indian attack. The King's Indian attack is a very, very popular opening for white. White starts with knight to f3. And again, we want to achieve the same setup. Bishop on f5, pawns on e6, d5, c6. Okay, d5. g3, King's Indian attack. Knight to f6. We always start with knight to f6 when we have black, because we simply cannot afford to play bishop f5 before securing the center. Long story short, play knight f6 first. Bishop to g2, c6, fine. Securing the diagonal before playing bishop f5. White castles, we play bishop f5. Okay, you know that you can play the London with white against the King's Indian defense. It's also possible to play it with black against the King's Indian attack. Absolutely same thing, except that you're a tempo down with black, which doesn't matter much because this is mostly going to be a positional maneuvering opening. Okay, d3, King's Indian attack, e6, knight b to d2, h6 again, don't allow knight to h4. And you can find many of my games in the London for black in the Road to GM series. Just have a look at them and you will see how I play against this. Okay, queen to e1 is the most common move for white, bishop to e7, e4 as we said, which is why we don't develop our bishop to d6. We just drop back to h7. And this is a very, very normal position. I've had it many times. You can find 3 tournament games which I've posted in the last month from this position. Okay, another very popular opening against which we can play the London system for black is the Nimzo-Larsen, and it's actually not possible to avoid the London system for black if white starts with pawn to b3. That solves many of my issues. I hated playing against the Nimzo-Larsen. I always try to come up with some weird stuff, but since I've started playing the London with black, I had absolutely no issues. So we start d5. They go bishop to b2. Again, we go knight to f6. Now, white can go g3 here. He can go knight f3. He can go e3. Doesn't matter. Whatever he does, we go bishop f5. Now, this could still be a reverse Dutch, with pawn to f4, it's possible to play the London against this, as we are going to see. It could still be a Queen's Indian in reverse, with, for example, knight to f3, e6, and bishop to e2. This is now a normal Queen's Indian for white. So we are playing the London against the Queen's Indian setup, or if you want to read the opening encyclopedia, against the Nimzo-Larsen still. So against b3, we can always achieve our setup. Just start with d5, knight f6, and whatever they do, let's say they do g3, we go bishop f5. Okay, against double fianchetto setups, this works perfectly. I've played this, I think, in every game where white has played the double fianchetto. Okay, now, one more setup against which this is unavoidable is the bird's opening or the reverse Dutch. They start f4, fine, we go d5. They go knight f3, we go knight f6. They go e3, we go bishop to f5. This is the so-called classical Dutch when it's played with black. I just call it classical Dutch with white. It's the bird's opening. This is technically called bird opening Dutch variation, but it's just a reverse Dutch. So we are playing our same setup. Bishop e2, e6, white castles, bishop to d6. Since e4, e5 is not going to be played, bishop d6 is okay. What if white goes for a Leningrad type setup with g3, bishop g2, same thing, we just do the same thing, bishop f5, pawn to d3, pawn to d3, we go e6, they go bishop to g2, bishop e7. It's possible to play bishop to d6, but if they haven't played e3, I prefer having my bishop on e7, both sides castle. And one thing I would like to mention, same as in the London for white, you don't always have to play with c6. You can also play with c5, knight c6. That's possible. You have the same choice in the London with white as well. Okay, if they try to go for Dutch with an early b3, same thing as against the Nimzo-Larsen. We have time to play bishop f5, e3, e6, bishop to b2, bishop to e7. Same thing. We play the London for black. Okay, and the final setup I would like to mention is the London system for white. Yes, you can play the London system against the London system. So they go d4, you go d5. Bishop to f4 or knight f3, doesn't matter. Again, start with knight f6. That's my recommendation with the black pieces. With white, I play bishop f4 on move 1, but with black, I start with knight f6 on move 2. Bishop f4 on move 2. e3, just bishop f5. And we are playing the London. Now, if white plays with c3 here, that's very passive. So white should be playing c4 and c6. Okay, and yeah, we are playing the London system. If white plays knight c3, you play e6, queen b3. There is some theory here, but there's theory in everything. The good news is that by playing the London for black, you are learning theory for 25 or 30% of openings for white. So if you know the London for black, all you have to prepare against is the Queen's Gambit and e4. And you need to find a setup for when white tries to avoid it by allowing his queen to come out to b3. So again, when you put your bishop on f5, b7 is a weakness, same as in the London. When you put your bishop on f4, b2 is a weakness. And it works against setups where early queen b3 is not possible. So again, Reti with b3, English that transposes to a Reti, reverse Dutch, reverse Queen's Indian, London system, and the Nimzo-Larsen. There are other minor setups for white against which this could work, but this is sort of my rule. Against these, I'm going to go for the London with black. And again, a complementary opening to go alongside the London for black is the Semi-Slav and the Caro-Kann. The first thing is, the first reason why is, if you're not allowed to play this, you're going to be allowed to play either the Semi-Slav or the Caro-Kann. The second thing is, it's the same structure. It's the same structure, it's just that your bishop is outside of the pawn chain. In the Caro-Kann, in the advanced variation and in some variations of the exchange, we get to put our bishop outside of the pawn chain. In the Semi-Slav, we don't. We would like to, but we don't have time to. It's not that people enjoy having a bishop on c8, it's that you don't have a choice. You don't have time to develop it. So the London system for black is basically a Semi-Slav where you've been allowed to develop your bishop. Okay, so completely different to the Semi-Slav because the bishop is outside, so the patterns are not the same, but similar structure, same structure, which makes it easier to play both together. Okay, I hope this helps. There may be some questions about this, and if you have any questions, post them in the comments below. Try to help each other. If you play the London with black, try to answer the comments below. If you have any experience with this, I'll try to get in on that as well. Thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.